Let's move on to Moyle v. U.S. This is a question as to whether the Supreme Court should essentially intervene in the order from a U.S. District Court for Idaho, which stopped, enjoins the enforcement of Idaho's Defense of Life Act on the grounds that because almost everywhere in Idaho, all of the medical facilities receive, I think, federal funding through either Medicaid or Medicare. There is a federal provision called the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, which basically says if somebody is in danger, you have to provide the appropriate medical response, which in some instances is abortion, despite the fact that Idaho has this abortion ban. And this was an attempt by the Biden administration to sort of like impose a federal almost safety net for access to abortion across the country. And so it's being tested here in Idaho. What went on?
So what the Biden administration is claiming is that the Idaho law conflicts with the federal law, and therefore is what we call preempted. Federal law is sovereign, and so the Idaho lawyers are in a weird sort of place where we have this federal law that says you need to provide emergency treatment, and that sort of obviously includes abortion in many cases. You have this Idaho law that says, well, you can only provide abortions in the case of a threat to the life of the mother. And what Idaho has argued is that these are the same thing, which sort of just hand waves away all of the various situations where you might need an abortion for medical reasons that fall short of threatening your actual life. Sotomayor just like peppered the Idaho attorney with all of these examples of real scenarios where pregnant people were experiencing an emergency that wasn't necessarily life-threatening but still required an abortion. There was one where a woman who had PPROM, premature rupture of the amniotic sac, and I apologize to anyone when I try to discuss women's health, and if I humiliate myself, it's not my fault, it's society's. So without an abortion, this can lead to, the need for a hysterectomy. But the mother's life is not at risk, and at least not in the short to medium term. And so Sotomayor is saying, well, this is obviously a conflict between these laws, and the Idaho law is obviously preempted in that case. And the attorney just sort of hemmed and hawed to the point where Justice Alito had to bail him out, basically, with a certain theory that's been floating around right-wing circles on this, which is that EMTALA, the federal law, it uses the term unborn child at one point, or a couple points, I should say. But basically, emergencies under this law include threats to the life of an unborn child. This was an amendment to the law. It got added in, I think, 89. The original law was passed in 86 because people were showing up to emergency rooms, and the emergency was to the fetus. And so this law was saying, okay, well, in that case, you have to provide care in that case too. That is also covered by the law. But Alito was making this claim that the term unborn child is just sort of like a pro-lifey kind of term. And doesn't that mean that the life of the unborn child is protected by the federal statute, and therefore the federal law actually doesn't require abortions at all? Which is, it really is just a vibes-based argument. Like, doesn't this kind of feel like pro-life? Doesn't this kind of feel pro-life to you? Yeah. There's nothing in the law that would forbid an abortion. Certainly doesn't expressly say so. There's nothing that says that you couldn't harm a fetus at any stage as part of emergency treatment for a pregnant person. So he's just sort of going for it, making it up and saying, at one point he said, like, I don't think, I feel like the Reagan administration wouldn't have wanted to do this.
It's also just sort of bizarre in the sense that, like, well, wait a second. What if the woman's or the pregnant person's life is in danger and you need to provide an abortion?
Right.
if what he's saying is the case, then it would actually even go further than the Idaho ban.
Yeah, that's right. At least that's like a fairly natural inference you could make from what he's saying.
He's doing a lot of inferring too. I mean,
he loves an inference, you know. Alito, I try not to parse his logic too much because his brain is truly melting before our eyes.
Yes.
And if you listen to oral arguments, it becomes clear that this is just a man who, watches Fox News at night, and maybe not Fox News. Maybe he's on that Newsmax tip. I don't know exactly what's going on with him, but he's melting down. It's been a rough few years for his brain. And I think if you try to dig into it too much, you will drive yourself a little bit nuts. So I try to take a step back and just say, I don't get it. I think he's just sort of a dick. And
well, I'm going to respect your mental health and not make you go any further with that one. So what's your sense of, Alito aside, did you get a sense of, where everyone else was on this?
It's really hard to say in this case. I think that if you look at like Amy Coney Barrett, a lot of people were saying, actually, she sounded pretty skeptical of Idaho, but she's done that before. I think she's quite, she likes to sort of bounce back and forth in oral arguments and then end up doing this sort of like generic conservative thing.
And she also has, I would imagine, particularly on questions about abortion. I mean, people may remember that she signed this this anti-abortion ad in the New York Times a couple of years before she became a justice. So I would imagine that there's like, if she has any sort of like sense of her image and her legacy and whatnot, which I'm quite convinced they all do in a big way. I would imagine her public statements about this need to be skeptical as a way of like sort of showing that she's really weighing these things as opposed to the reality when she had decided them 15 years ago, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so hard in a lot of these cases. I mean, the potential headlines here are pretty rough for the conservatives, especially in an election year. That hasn't stopped them before, but the idea that they might come to a conclusion where the most extreme situations are that the life of the mother like isn't protected in these situations. I think those sorts of scenarios probably weigh in their minds. So hard to say. The Idaho attorney was the position's really difficult to defend, but the court has a ton of options in terms of middle grounds. They're probably not going to bite on that Alito unborn child thing, but they can sort of define the Idaho law and the federal law however they choose and then try to reconcile them in some way. That's my best guess, is that they try to forge a middle ground there. But I also think that the sort of fundamental idea that these laws conflict would be pretty hard for them to avoid. I don't want to give them credit, but I don't know how they come out saying that the laws don't conflict and that the federal law isn't the dominant law in these situations. But I've been wrong before. John Roberts is a creative dude.
Right.
Well, I mean, the border, right? That we thought that it might be a slam dunk for them to do something a little bit reasonable and say, oh, of course the federal government has authority over the border, and they declined to do so. But that's a whole
I can't tell you how many times that like legal nerds like me have seen a case and been like, no way.
Yeah.
No way that the Supreme Court is going to entertain this. And then we all get humbled and embarrassed because of course they do. Yeah.
I remember how people were saying there's no way the Supreme Court's going to take this case from Florida about the election. That's just no way they're ever going to do that in 2000. That was that to me, I think, was one of the most, as far as for as long as I've been paying attention to this stuff, that seems to be the one which like the institution, the legal institution, law as an institution in this country was most shocked. And then 9/11 happened and it was all, people forgot about it.